Welcome to another episode of Well, Don't Tell the Kids. I'm Janet Lee, your host, and today I'm very happy to be speaking with my guest, Nancy Robinson-Shaffer. I wanted to welcome you to the podcast, Nancy.
Thank you, Janet.
Nancy is joining us for a conversation from Colorado.
Silverthorne. It's 60 miles up from Denver.
Has winter begun there yet?
Well, it's funny, we are now on the maps because they call it Goldthorne because of our gold medal winner, Red Gerard, came from this town, and my son and a bunch of others are snowboarders just like him. So, yeah, it is. We are just melting. There's still Whitecap Mountains, beautiful green, and we have 90 days without snow, and then we'll go back to 9 months of snow.
But you're not originally from there, from what I understand. No. You're originally from the East Coast?
I am from McLean, Virginia. Actually, I grew up in New York City, and then with the Reagan administration, my parents moved to D.C., and then I spent a couple of decades in D.C. until I was 50, and then I decided to make a change.
To your undergraduate years at Randolph-Macon College. Can you tell us a little bit about what you studied there and where you went from there?
Sure, yeah. So coming from a big high school in McLean, it was, 500 or so in our graduating class. I thought I wanted to go back to a smaller atmosphere. When you grow up in New York and you go to Dalton School, there was, 50 people in my graduating class. I come to Langley, 500. It was overwhelming. I spent 2 years there, and I thought I wanted to go back to something smaller. So I went to a liberal arts education down in Ashland, Virginia, couple hundred in the school. Fantastic way to go into college because it was safe, it was good, you could do a lot. I was on conduct council, I was, ran for president of my class, freshman class, so there was a lot you could do quickly. I played soccer for school. I actually played for that first year. And then as I got into my second year, I kind of realized this was a really small school. So joined a great sorority. I was a Kappa Alpha Theta, and then I started looking around for bigger programs. I had always wanted to go into journalism and media, so I found that University of Maryland had a fantastic RTVS school, and that's where I wanted to go, and ultimately headed to Maryland 2 years later for that. And the good news was they had a great Kappa Alpha Theta program, so I was able to go straight from house to house and have immediate friends. So, and at the time my mom had cancer and was dying, so I had to be close to home, and she ended up passing away my senior year. So it was kind of a needed change.
Do you think that your mother's illness, if you would like to speak about this, it must have had some kind of
huge impact? Yeah.
Can you characterize maybe the one that stands out most in your mind?
Sure. Well, I think for me, I'm an only girl child, so I had my mom and my dad and me, and we traveled so much, and being that my dad was in the administration and ambassador, he traveled to China and Russia a lot, my mom and I were very, very tight. And when she passed on, it was like I got tipped out of the cradle because I was very protected as an only child in an affluent society. It was just me and Mom. I was a debutante. I had all the best of the best. And then when Mom died, everything changed. I had to start over. I had to do my taxes myself because she always protected me and made my life so wonderful that a dad's a different type of, the male influence is different. So now I had to negotiate having my dad and me only. And that was a very hard change to make. And weirdly enough, even at that time, I decided I wanted to leave McLean and try and start over. And I left Florida. So I made my first real change when I decided shortly after my mom's funeral to move to Florida. My grandmother was there in Palm Beach. So I was taking care of her, and then she passed on. So now we're back to more change. So now it's back to me and Dad. I go back to McLean to take care of my dad, essentially, and to join him. And I ended up staying. I studied in college. I was working with the Christian Science Monitor and Discovery Channel because they had a department in D.C. that I could join. So I did that, and that was the whole mom, going back to the mom passing away piece. That was something I never got over. It took me decades to work through that. I was already a mom myself at that point. I had two young boys, and it really helped me put in perspective that I needed to roll with change. The only thing constant in our world is change. They played David Bowie's Changes song quite a few times that we danced to. It was, but I had to actually get through that and get over it and heal. Other pieces that have come up, including the divorce that happened about 10 years later.
Thank you for sharing that.
No, I'll say, Janet, one of the things that we know about ourselves is sometimes it is uncomfortable to be out there, like talking about this and sharing this type of stuff is uncomfortable. But sometimes the reason I've decided to share it is not I'm kind of an out there person. I'm definitely an extrovert. But if I were to take a Myers-Briggs, I actually register as an introvert because my natural internal is not to share this stuff. But I figure if we don't share it, we can never then by sharing, you're inviting other people, women, men, whomever, kids, to say, I want to understand that experience. I'm feeling the same way too. But if you don't put it out there, it's almost like putting a hand out. If you don't put a hand out, nobody's going to take it. That's kind of why I share this stuff, and I'm really open to any and all of that sharing of these type of experiences, even though they're painful and even though they helped me grow. I wouldn't get to, it's like climbing a mountain. Now I live in Colorado, everybody climbs 14ers. I couldn't even imagine that, but my 12-year-old son climbed one because they just took them one level at a time.
I have that you were in Maryland going into international business, but you just mentioned journalism and RTVF, so I'm wondering how that transition came about or what happened.
Yeah, no, I went to RTVF and realized that one of my focuses that I loved was all my dad being an ambassador and having trips to China and Russia. He was part of the World's Fair where he was actually one of the people involved in the kitchen debate with Khrushchev and Nixon. So kind of the historical background I grew up listening to and being part of as an only child was being exposed to these incredible State Department dinners and being part of these, Kissinger sitting at dinner with us and some of these really cool experiences. So I wanted to learn more about the international peace and the laws that governed our land. We were in the Cold War at that time, Germany bringing down the wall. All this stuff was happening in my 20s, and so I really wanted to learn more about it. Plus, the Christian Science Monitor is a newspaper that I really felt was factual, and I loved this paper. I loved the other papers as well, but this had a lot of international background. I felt like I learned a lot from it. I was introduced in high school to the newspaper when we were trying to learn more about different international pieces, especially with Germany and Russia. And so the international law side and the international relations was really interesting, and then I double majored with an English major, and my English teacher happened to be in RTVF. So I kind of in some ways had a foot in both camps because I was always at the RTVF school, and I really wanted to be on air. I really wanted to write and produce. And then I ended up at Discovery Channel and on the news station actually producing. But that was also the time when my mom had just passed and all that. So I think because of the passing of the family, I ended up back in D.C. and trying to find a restart, trying to find a grounding because there were so many different changes happening in my life. And that came by, weirdly enough, working with a catering company where I met my husband. And that grounded me for 20 years. When I'm trying to help mentor kids or talk to people about businesses, what we are heading in a Porsche, fast and furious into our careers. I don't think that 50% of us actually end up where we started or where we were heading. And I see that with my son going to engineering school at CU Boulder. He's now not in the engineering school because he realized after a year of it, it was not his thing. That's part of, especially when the younger people, the younger set, it's not, don't worry about, heading straight in fast and furious. Experience life and get a taste of everything, which is kind of why I loved Randolph-Macon, was it was liberal arts. So you weren't focused into having to go to that specific class and that specific major every day.
I've spoken with a handful of Saxons in Langley, and I think that's really, it's showing now, a generation later, that strength of that education back, that foundation. It's very interesting because I went into engineering, but had a strong, humanities setup at the high school level. So that's really
very true. That my son, I do believe, dealt with what NBC News did a whole focus on just last week of college depression. It's that they think they're going into something, they're going straight as an arrow, and then the arrow bends with the wind. And, and you get what you consider to be perceived to be off track. And you're not being off track. You're just going with where you were maybe supposed to be. Maybe, you're getting exposed to so much more that you go, why? That wasn't really where I was supposed to be. Hey, guess what? It's okay to go off track because technically when you're growing up, your track is wide open. How you want to take that vein, it's almost like The Road Less Taken with Robert Frost. If you stand at that path, At some point, the path is going to have roads where you have to choose. But right now, you don't have to. You can really expose yourself, and I do encourage people and younger kids, younger generations, to get exposed to as much as they can, because they're going to be working for a long time. And it's hard to change careers. When I had to change careers at 45 years old with a divorce, because I was married to a chef, and my career was with this chef and with this company as event planner. I was the event planner, he was the chef. All of a sudden, I didn't have that ability anymore. I couldn't work with him. So I had to totally take a different sidewind.
Why don't you walk us through that a little bit? So now we've gotten through the University of Maryland College Park period.
Sure. Interestingly enough, it was a very succinct 20-year period. I actually started catering at Maryland in 1986 and did my first wedding in 1986. I kind of kept a foot on that path because it was always this, it was something that was easy. I could go be a waiter or a waitress, and it was always extra money, and it was the way I went. So I understood the hospitality industry. Then I started really focusing in on the production and media. Up in Boston, I ended up in the Christian Science Monitor television station there. And then because I came home because of the passings of the family. Then when I married the chef, we kind of grew into this event planning. I'd get the events, I'd get the weddings, he'd kind of cook it. We would bring our business to other bigger catering companies. And we went up the line. We started with smaller catering companies like Le Bon Cafe, which was up on Capitol Hill. We started with them, and then we kind of grew into this where he ended up with Design Cuisine. And we had another company that we were working with that we owned called Cuisine One. And we merged into Design Cuisine. He was the catering person. I would bring all my events there. And then that was a good 15 years. And Nancy Shaffer and Associates was really an event planning company that helped all different events, but really had a focus. 50% of my time was on weddings. And that's actually how I to the next piece once that piece of my life ended, where during the divorce I had two little kids. They were 7 and 11. So now you couldn't do much hospitality stuff when you had 7, 11-year-old kids and you were alone, because stuff was always at nights and weekends, and I needed to be home for them. So I kind of looked around, and I had a dear friend who was also one of our lacrosse coaches who was the general manager at Sightline Media Group. And he said, "You've been in media. You understand events. Let's put those two skills together." So I never thought my media stuff would come into play, and it ended up really working for me. And then I was with Sightline Media Group, which is basically was the military products of USA Today and Gannett, and they've now branched off on their own, but they are Navy Times, Military Times, Defense News. And then we did events around that. So I combined those two skills, but coming back into the work market, I didn't even know what a VPN was, Janet. I didn't even know how to do expense reports. I had not been in Microsoft Suite, really actively using things like PowerPoints and things like that in 10 years. So coming back into the industry and into an office setting and working with a big company with insurance benefits, even 401ks, I didn't deal with any of that. When I got married at 27, my husband had all that. So when kind of the bottom dropped out and I had to restart at 45 years old, it was a really challenging. I went into full depression. I was like, I was in a car accident that same kind of months that we decided to divorce. And when I was in the accident, I kind of looked up. I realized I was alive and well, and it was a bad accident, but I was still there. And I kind of looked up at the sky and I thought, why didn't you take me? Please, just let me, out of this. And when I realized I had survived the car accident, I realized that I had to start over. And that was really almost the inception of a whole other phase. And I was 45 years old.
When you're in a wedding, you're putting together that whole big, huge event. Any funny disaster story?
One of them, my favorite one, well, here's the simplest story that I can say is this lady loved her wedding shoes. She had special ordered them. She is now wearing her flip-flops, as we all know how high heels do not feel fun. So the whole day, so she gets out of the limousine, she puts her box of shoes on top of the limousine, she's in her flip-flops, we all get her out, the dress is massive, we're getting her into a Georgetown church, the limo pulls away, the shoes are on top of the limo. So, those are that. So she walked down in flip-flops and was not happy about it. But it was, but at the same time, it was funny because she had a focus on these shoes. You have some of those brides and grooms that haven't talked through some of the specifics of what the future is going to look like. And one of the two of them, I'll just pick a groom, decided to sit in the bar all night long and ponder what the rest of his life was going to be like. And I had to go get him out of the bar to go down the aisle. So that was, thank God, in the midst of my career when I had good staff and I could send, have people with the bride. But this was where my psychology, kind of began. Was sitting at the bar next to him, and he had been drinking all night long. And I said, you guys are so broke because you got to go down the aisle in about an hour and a half. So why don't we talk about why you're sitting here for about 2 minutes, and we can finish that conversation in my car on the way to church. So that was the fun one. But I will say this generation, this is what I'm finding fascinating. Now doing weddings at Keystone with Vail Resorts, I am seeing about 500 couples a year. We're doing about 140 weddings, even more than that. And I am meeting these incredible couples, and every single one of them is acknowledging divorce during the wedding planning. It is this generation understands divorce more than any other generation I've heard of, and they understand how they want to work through it and how this is a commitment. It's not about love and hate and money and sex. It's about the commitment they're making to a family, especially if they're going to have children, to the future of these children not going through what they've gone through, because most of them, 50% of them have.
It's coming up as a topic to explore?
Yeah, it's becoming a topic in tandem with marriage. How do we not get divorced? How do we address these situations now? And so many, it's interesting. A lot of people are almost not just prenup. It's no longer about the prenup as much. It's about the discussion of what do we want? And one of the things that I am loving and I'm trying to bring to couples now in my older, mature times is that it's really it's just like what we were talking about earlier, where you think you're going to college for engineering and you end up as a caterer, or you think you're going to engineering and end up as a reporter. Our best laid plans are not what's going to happen in 10 years. Something happens. Life does just happen. And how we deal with life, the toolbox that we have filled to deal with our problems are really how we're going to get through to the end in a marriage especially. And I think one of the biggest problems is they actually one of the weekly reports, there's a bunch of stuff on divorce coming out right now, and even in the markets and in Bloomberg, they had it on MSNBC too, was all about divorce happening in their 50s. 20 years is now kind of the itch. It's no longer 7 years because you've grown apart, you've focused on the kids if you had them, and then all of a sudden, what do you have together? And it's how to rebuild that life together 20 years later, older, maybe not as attractive, maybe not as athletic, and maybe not having any of the same interests. Because when you first get together, you've got the same interests a lot of the time. And then you got to figure out how to survive when, one's a meat eater and the other's vegan. And that's sometimes what happens 20 years down the road.
You have to back up and tell me a little bit how you got to Colorado.
Yeah, well, I have to say podcasts are a little bit to be credited for that. I listen to a lot of podcasts on change and about, how to, So when I was listening to these, because, 2 and 3 minute podcasts, even 15, 20-minute conversation dialogues like we're having, I was literally just going to anything. Just I would talk to Siri, podcast on change, podcast on divorce, and I would listen to different pieces. One of the things you hear, you've always heard people say, and Oprah and everybody else, put it on your mirror, put a Post-it, write it down, put it in front of you, look at it. I'm a 1,000% believer in that. I literally bought this humongous Post-it note, and I put, what do I do next? So then I put all these ideas. I would literally I had a Sharpie next to it, and it was on my bathroom mirror, and I started writing down. I was like, I could move. Well, when you're divorced, one of the things that you don't realize is when you have kids and you're divorced, you can't move. You're locked in there. So the one thing that came up is, when the kids turn 18 or when they go to college, I was very grateful to my ex-husband that he let me move. He let me have a restart by letting me get in-state residency and move to Colorado. So I'm very grateful for that piece. But I think the real change started when I started looking for it. I think that's the number one thing. You have to look for it. You have to open yourself up to something new. If you're going to constantly look down at the ground, you're going to walk the line in front of you. But when you start looking up at the sky, you get a whole new possibility. There's now infinite possibilities. My dad always said he always ended with his swimming with a backstroke so he could look up at the sky and be reminded of the infinite possibilities up there. So I love that. When I started writing on my Post-it, the more I wrote, there was probably 35 different things. I could change careers. I can be a counselor. I could go back to events and start a company. And I went through all these things. And one of the things that came up was I was a ranch hand in Colorado briefly in Buena Vista with this camp. It was a really weird story. Basically, my dad had an intern in college that when he was in the State Department, the intern, he offered a job, and then the guy said, I can't. I run a ranch in Colorado for the summer. I can't start till after that. Well, my dad literally says to him, my dad says, hey, my daughter rides horses. She can do this. And he literally, my freshman year, coming home from Randolph-Macon, said, pack the trunk. You're going next week to Buena Vista, Colorado. I'm like, where is that? And he's like, and my dear friend, who I'm still friends with 40 years later, Glenn Grow, was like, I'm sorry, I need I want the job. And I go to this camp where I'm a ranch hand, and I have this fantastic 8-week experience where I'm in aspen trees, and cougars are literally, mountain lions are walking around my camp, and scary, fun, exciting. And I thought to myself, if anything ever happened in my life, I want to be back here. This is peace to me. And all of a sudden that dawned on me one day when I was running. I trained for Marine Corps Marathon right before I moved out here, and I ran it. But in those hours and hours of running, I planned my journey. I basically thought, okay, well, what do I do with these hours of running? And I thought, okay, well, I think I want to move to Colorado. Well, how do I do it? So then I literally would, stop and take a note on my phone. It would take a break and then go back out. And I started with this big Post-it note again. Now, how do I get to Colorado? Interestingly enough, I will say one of our Langley grads saw my journey on Facebook as I was trying to kind of make this plan, and he was actually at the end the impetus to really get me to go, because he said, I have a job for you. You could, come work for my company. And I thought, this is fantastic. This is the dream job. And then I had to really make a commitment. And I said, nope, you know what? I can't work for you because I'm committed to this Colorado move. And I ended up, weirdly enough, Janet, moving out what I thought was going to be to Denver. So here's the best laid plans of mice and men. So in my job situation, I had a great transfer job. I was working with the Sightline thing was actually owned by Tegna, who is Channel 9 in Colorado. So I had almost a secure job in Channel 9 in Denver. I found a friend of mine was getting divorced, and they had a house for rent. So I was going to rent their house in Highlands Ranch in Colorado. I had this job. I'm all set. Well, it turns out they ended up selling their house, and the job at Channel 9 went away. All within, I was moving out July 1st, and that literally dropped out May 15th. And I thought, oh, my goodness, now what do I do? Maybe this was a wrong plan altogether. And I ended up talking to my ex-brother-in-law who lived up here in Silverthorne. And he said, you know what, come out. I'd love to see my nephews. Even though you guys are divorced, I'm still friends with you. Come out, live in my house for a couple weeks, find your footing here. And that was next door to Keystone. And literally, again, opening to the universe, just asking for it, saying, what do I do now? I can't tell you how many times I sat at Lake Dillon by this eagle and cried with a blanket around me because it was cold. It was always cold here. And I just would cry every night. And I was like, what did I do? How did I get myself here? I just left all my friends, all my security. And within a couple of days, I went online and I saw this wedding job at Keystone. And that was in July, and then I applied for it, and weirdly enough, they said, it's going to be open soon, and every month that same answer came. And it never opened until January. So I again went back to the Eagle crying, sitting at Lake Dillon, and, said, what do I do now? And I had always thought that I loved teaching kids to ski, because my kids learned to ski in ski school, and they hated every minute of it. It was a big, cold nightmare. And I thought, well, I could make this better for kids. So weirdly enough, I called up Keystone, said, hey, if I join ski school, how do you know I can ski? And he said, can you pick a kid up and put it on the carpet? And I said, yes, I can do that. And he said, I will teach you the rest, literally. So he said, from now, which was end of July, beginning of August, he said, from now till November, when you start with us, I'm going to put you on staff. But get in shape, get altitude ready, get your back and your core solid, because you're going to be picking up kids and putting them on this carpet. That's your thing, because you're going to teach 3 to 5 year olds. Once you learn to teach, and I can see you can ski, we can put you up in the ranks. So literally that's how it started. And then finally the weddings job came through, and it was an immediate transfer within a week. You're hired. We finally have the job. And January 1st I started. So I was in the best shape I was ever in, I'll tell you. But it was. Yeah, well, it's what I do. They basically start with me. Anybody who's going to get married at Keystone, they come to me, and I start the process with them. But I think the biggest thing here that I would ever say, and I always say this to my kids, and they hate it by now, of course, is be open to anything. if you open yourself up to anything, you will get anything. You will get some of the best stuff because you had no idea, if what was available to you if you were just pigeonholing yourself and saying, I will only take that job at that price.
You posted a little bit ago on social media something that I assume spoke to you. You were referencing an article by Brene Brown, The Midlife Unraveling, which came out at the end of May. And Brene Brown is a researcher and storyteller. And in that article, she quoted Maya Angelou. And this quote was in a previous episode of mine, so I left it out.
It resonated with you.
Yeah, because I'd spoken about it with another guest. Maya Angelou wrote, "There's no greater agony than burying an untold story inside you." And Brene Brown goes on to say, "I've always honored the power of story. In fact, I believe so strongly in their power, or the power of story, that I've dedicated my career to excavating untold stories and bringing them up to the light." So I wanted to know if this relates to your journey at all. And I know that you are exploring a new direction for the future, so maybe those things possibly go together.
They do. And, I'm grateful for people like you, Janet, who are doing exactly what that says. You're bringing people's stories out so that, when somebody hears somebody else's story, I mean, that's how AA even, got more popular. It's wonderful. And I really think that this is just so important because the podcast is really how people are tuning in right now. Every generation, every age, my dad and his age and my kids and their age, 2 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, they can do it while they're driving, while they're walking, while they're doing anything, and they're gaining knowledge and information. And these story sharings, I mean, story sharing is the tale as old as time. This is what people remember in the prairie days when there wasn't TV and radio. They would sit and the older generation would share the stories with the younger generation. And this is, so continuing that through in this social media age is brilliant. It's the way we can share, worldwide. I'm not going to veer off track of event planning and weddings and things like that. I'm adding into that I've shared my story way too openly probably on Facebook. I've had a lot of people come to me on the side saying, why did you do that? Why did you share this? Part of it was because I shared my hurt because I wanted people to understand it's okay. But I also had a sense in me, and I don't know why I had this, that I would be okay. And then if I shared the hurt at the time so raw, that the cooked meat, that finished product that would come on a pretty plate might be served at some point. I was hopeful, and it also gave me direction that if I shared this awful rawness, sometimes I said things I really wish I wouldn't have said. It gave me, I had to have the end result come out. I had to be where I am today, because if I only left it where I was just moaning and griping, then I hadn't really come full circle. And it gave me, it was actually almost in a way selfish on my part, that it was my impetus to move forward and to heal and to come to the other side of this. But now I can say I've come that far. It is a clawing. I mean, I remember spending a Thanksgiving day on my floor in a house where I saw a mouse run right by me because I was in this tiny little rat hole in Virginia because that's all I could afford at the time, the year that the separation started. And I literally spent the entire Thanksgiving in my own tears and my own snot and lying on the floor in my church clothes. And I literally spent that time there until one of my girlfriends realized I hadn't shown up for dinner, and she came and she got me. It may have been 10 hours that I was on that floor because I was the first year I didn't have my kids. They were at visitation. I had never been through divorce. I didn't know what that meant or what that felt like. So in the new set of things, I'm hoping to add in and pull in the counseling and divorce advice, not because I have a master's in it, not because I'm educated in it, but I have gone through the school of life in it where I was given tools and put together a toolbox, a tool belt to get through this, and I'd like to share that. That's what I'm hoping in the end, to share both with children and with teens and with people going through this. That's a really challenging time for young adults to have to deal with divorce. So I want to kind of try and help all those different pieces get together and bring the idea of divorce openly into marriages. Because when you're getting married is the time when you really need to be prepared for the fact this is about commitment. This is a commitment to find every which way. I know a motocross guy that I absolutely love. He was in a motorcycle accident, and he was newly married and had kids, young kids, and he no longer could, function from the waist down. Well, how do you stay married with that? How do you get through all those surgeries and the pain and whatever as a young married couple with young kids? Decades later, he and his wife are strong and good and showing people what it's like, what a good marriage looks like, but they had to work through it all. It was not easy. When I started posting about the divorce on Facebook, especially years later when I would post more positive things or I would give, both the negative and the positive, I started getting side IMs, a direct message and text from people who were interested in getting divorced or they were unhappy in their marriage. Some were couples, some were females or males, singularly would call and say, hey, I think I'm at the end. I think I want to get divorced. Can you tell me what it's like can you tell me what divorcing in Virginia is like legally? Which, of course, I couldn't do. I could say, this is my experience. But you'd come down to a place where they would say, what's my wife going to go through? What are my kids going to go through? And that 90% of the people that called and asked for those questions are still married. And it's not about me. I'm proud of them that they reached out to see how the effect would be. So I'm offering free advice. I've got that, especially because a lot of people can't afford therapy and can't afford to pay somebody. I'm very straight out that I don't have any sort of degree in it, but I do have that 8 to 10 years experience living it. And then hopefully I probably will start pursuing the education piece if it's helpful to people. If it is, then I will pursue it, and that will be definitely a direction I take. One of the things that we didn't touch on more in that article, but the idea of the midlife unraveling. And I think when we understand that midlife is a larger part of our life than any other piece, it is an unraveling. It's not an event. It doesn't just happen like a 16th birthday or a bar mitzvah or a wedding. It is something that unravels right in front of you. And the story, your story basically is in front of you, and you go, wow, I didn't want my story to be that. I didn't want that unraveling. Can I please ravel it back up and pick a new piece of yarn? Because this isn't what I wanted to be given. That's not my expectation. And then have some people who have. I always laugh when they say, tell God your plan, and He's going to laugh, because you really have to watch and be as we were talking about. You can't really be as much of a planner in life as you want to be, because life just happens for you. But how you react and how you respond to these unravelings are really what make life sweet. And that's something we all have a common bond in. And how you get through those with the grace that you get through that midlife unraveling. And also, why is it a crisis? It's midlife. We all go through it. It's part of living. So if we call it a crisis, then our words are bonding us to it being problematic versus living.
So I think that's very encouraging.
Thank you. Well, it's almost like those gold rush guys. They're looking for a nugget.
We'll call that a wrap once again for all of your insights and conversation, Nancy.
Oh, thank you for your time today, too. I really appreciate sharing and hearing your stories and hearing the stories that you're recording for others.
Thank you all for listening. So once again, my guest has been Nancy Robinson-Shaffer. I'm Janet Lee. Please stay tuned for more episodes of Well, Don't Tell the Kids.